Hi there. In this lecture, we're going to talk about two very important philosophical and religious traditions in China, Taoism and Buddhism. To begin with, we'll talk about how Taoism, this sort of indigenous religious tradition, emerged in China, and we'll talk about how the arrival of Buddhism sort of complemented and challenged some of those early notions of Taoism. Now, we had already talked about Confucianism. Confucianism was a religion that came from a particular individual. And unlike Confucianism, Taoism cannot really be attributed to any one person. A very important philosophical text, one of the earliest texts we have on Taoism, the Tao Te Ching, is attributed to an author by the name of Lao Tzu, whose name simply means venerable master. Lao Tzu is a name for a person that sort of coalesces a whole lot of different ideas that go way back in ancient times of China's philosophy and sort of compiled together and given this author's name, much the same way we have large compendium of texts and ideas and nursery rhymes we call Mother Goose. The name Lao Tzu is just a sort of placeholder for these philosophical ideas. The oldest existing copy of this text, the Tao Te Ching, comes from about the 3rd or 2nd century BCE. The book is a series of sort of poetic, enigmatic paragraphs. It's a very short text, but each one is a kind of powerful meditation on the ambiguities of understanding the world. Here, for example, is one such passage from the Tao Te Ching. We join spokes together in a wheel, but is the center whole that makes the wagon move. We shape clay into a pot, but it is the emptiness inside that holds whatever we want. We hammer wood for a house, but it is the inner space that makes it livable. We work with being, but it is non-being that we use. So in this passage, we're given a series of concrete examples of how we use things in our lives, and yet the utility of those things is not the thing we made, but in fact the space inside, that is the emptiness that is inside those things that we have made, as a way of making us appreciate not just the thing, but the absence of things, the negative or the antithesis of the thing, not exactly the antithesis. And so there's sort of this relationship between the material world and this kind of emptiness. This is sort of the absence of matter, and the way in which these form and emptiness kind of enhance one another, complement one another. And this is sort of this idea of yin and yang comes from. Together, we talk about these sort of symbols, the yin-yang symbol. I'm sure you're probably familiar with this image from somewhere before. It's quite popular and common. I remember seeing it way back in the 1970s. And it's something that has been a kind of commonplace image for what we call these two polar opposites, yin and yang. Yin is the dark tiger, yielding. Yang is the white, light dragon, direct. And inside the yang there is yin, and inside the yin there is yang. And if you could take that yin within the yang you could subdivide that even further and see another yin inside that yang and another yang inside that yin. It's infinite regression of yin and yang inside each other. And together they represent this concept of Tai Chi, the supreme ultimate. Now the symbol we're looking at here is actually a more contemporary symbol that was devised in about the 16th century AD or CE. The earlier ideas that represent yin and yang are mentioned below here, the dragon and the tiger. And so when people were referring to yin and yang, they believed the origins of yin and yang were ways in which people talked about mountains. Mountains would have a sort of windward side that would be dry and a leeward side that would be rainy. And these two different sides of the mountain, one that received lots of light and was dry and arid, and the other one which was lush and green. This was sort of this idea of this yin and yang on the mountain. Further explorations in this idea of Taoism can be found in another ancient text called the I Ching, the Book of Changes. Now this is a much older book. It still contains this idea of yin and yang, and yet it is composed in these ideas that sort of undergird the sense that yin and yang represents change, fundamental change that can be found in everything about our lives. And if we can understand the flow of yin and yang, the nature of these changes, we can understand what's going on in our lives. And so the I Ching, this book of changes, was a kind of oracle, a way that people meditated on their lives and tried to anticipate unexpected changes in the future. This book organizes the idea of yin and yang into a series of diagrams, which are called trigrams, with 3 lines, broken lines and straight lines. And these combinations of 3 lines, the broken line is yin, the straight line is yang, and yin and yang in various combinations create each of these trigrams. You combine 2 trigrams together and you create a hexagram. And that is sort of how this oracle of the I Ching works. You sort of look at how one portion of your current existence is sort of transforming into another kind of condition. And there are 64 total hexagrams, and you're in some point in this transformation from one state into another. Another important aspect of Taoism comes into medicine. The flow of yin and yang is all throughout the universe, and it affects our bodies. Our bodies have these flowing of energy. And so very early on, there was ways that medicinal users were trying to redirect the flow of someone's energy, this qi energy, through their bodies. And they found that these needles inserted in certain points would redirect and refocus the energy and provide healing and relief from pain. And so for thousands of years, they believe this acupuncture has been practiced in China. We don't really understand how it works. The traditional means for explaining this is that it is operating on the spiritual level, this sort of flow of invisible energy that's running through our body. And so you see this diagram here, this line that runs down this man's cheek, across the chest and over down the arm and onto the wrist. This line does not represent any real anatomical part of the body. You're not actually curing or affecting some nerve or some muscle. You're really affecting this invisible flow of energy. Other areas that Taoism has come in is in a field of mysticism known as geomancy, trying to predict the most auspicious place in the landscape, sort of being able to interpret the ideas of the flow of energy within the rocks and forms that are found in the world. And this is called feng shui. And then also we see Taoist influences in Chinese martial arts, wushu. Now in feng shui, one of the most important tools that a feng shui master will use is this compass. Now, China discovered the compass hundreds of years before it was ever discovered elsewhere. And this compass was used not as a sort of navigational device, but as a way to kind of understand the flow of energy, qi, through the environment. And this is called the lo pan. Here you can see this really complicated diagram that subdivides all the different parts of the lo pan. The vast majority of the information that people find on the lo pan directly relates to the earliest function of the lo pan, which was to divine the most auspicious place where someone would bury your ancestors. So if you were to have this important job, you would want to make sure that your parents or grandparents were buried in the most auspicious place possible, because from that place they would receive the benefits of the flow of the energy from the landscape, and then they could redirect that back to you in the real world. And so a great many of the arts of feng shui relate to this idea of finding the most suitable place for burial. Now, today, of course, people think of feng shui as interior decorating or all kinds of other things, but in reality, it comes down to this very essential and very important job of finding a burial place for your ancestors. Martial arts in China are very old. Wushu has been practiced way back from the dawn of time. We saw in the terracotta soldiers without any kind of armor or any kind of weapons, standing in a very distinctive way, what's known as the horse stance. And so we have from these ancient texts knowledge of people having to this fighting with their bare hands, using the strength of their opponent against themselves, in a sense, yielding and moving against the person and overcoming them with their own strength. This idea of martial arts was enormously influential all across Asia. Later in its history, it became codified into a series of movements in a very specific kind of martial art known as Tai Chi Chuan, which means the supreme ultimate fist. Chuan means fist. Tai Chi Chuan has a history that goes back to the 16th century AD and is a form of meditation and a form of physical exercise that allows you to kind of find your balance. Now, Taoism was primarily a philosophical tradition. But as the Han Dynasty began to kind of fall apart and the traditional structures of Confucianism were questioned, people began to cast about for new spiritual meaning. And they latched upon Taoism that had been there before Confucianism, and it began to develop sort of religious practices around Taoist beliefs. And so we begin to see a spiritual, philosophical ideas about how the world works develop into rituals and other ways of honoring and giving offerings to such personages as Lao Tzu, the legendary creator of the Tao Te Ching. This object here is a bronze vessel that is used to burn incense. It was found in the tomb of Prince Liu Sheng in about 113 BC, and is an exquisite example of what's called a mountain censer, or Bo Shan Lu. The mountain censer would have been placed in a brazier of water, and so it would have looked like a mountain or an island. And inside this cup, incense would burn, and through small holes on the cap, the smoke would come out and settle around the base, and it would look like a mountain surrounded by a cloud of mist. And this is why this sort of mystical image of the mountain, the mystical an abode of the immortals, a place where special blessed people could find release from the trials and tribulations of this world. Taoist Immortals, there's always 8 of them. I'm just showing you 6 here, but the 8 Taoist Immortals are stuff of folk legend, and they are sort of ordinary people. There's a flower seller, a flute player, there's various characters of everyday life who have, through their very ordinariness, have come across a kind of deep understanding of the Tao. And because they have found that deep, penetrating understanding of the Tao, they live with perfect harmony, and so they are immortal. And so they receive a kind of Godhead for their knowledge of Taoism. It's not like an intellectual kind of knowledge. It's not like Confucianism, which is all about trying to find your way in the world through thinking through things. Taoism is more like just sort of being in the right place at the right time. Now, it's this time that Taoism is becoming a religion that another religion does enter into China from India, and that is Buddhism. Now, in this class, I'm only going to give you a very cursory description of Buddhism. I spend a great deal more time on Buddhism in the undergraduate, the lower division class on Asian art, and on the upper division class on India, Southeast Asia. But in this case here, it's important to sort of remember or have a basis understanding of what Buddhism is all about. Buddhism was a religion that came to China by way of India. It had developed there based on the teachings of one man who's known as Gautama Siddhartha of the Sakya people, who we have only vague accounts of his life and times. Estimates suggest he lived sometime in the 6th century. Here in this image, I am showing you one of the earliest known surviving Buddhist statues from about 338 CE or AD. This statue is modeled after a form of Buddhism from the Kunshan dynasty in India, which is at the time there was a great deal of exchange of ideas, and there were people who traveled all the way to India to learn more about Buddhism. Buddhism, the earliest texts, as they arrive in China, as they're trying to make sense of Buddhist teachings, they use a lot of Taoist concepts and ideas to explain them. They saw a great affinity between Buddhism and Taoism. And so in these early years of understanding Buddhism, it kind of became a way of also reflecting on Taoism. In Buddhism, the central teaching surrounds this notion of the 4 noble truths. And these are, to paraphrase generally, that everything is in a constant state of change, and that we suffer in this world because we don't want to accept change. We want permanence, and we can't accept that we are thrust into a changing world. And so Buddhism says the only way you can reduce suffering in this world is by accepting change and not becoming attached to things that do not, or expecting things not to change. And so this was sort of the core philosophical component. It's actually a very, very deep and complicated religion. But the main goal is a process by which you find a way to lessen your attachments to this world. Now, one of the ways in which Buddhism was and was felt to have an affinity with Taoism was the sense of change and flow. Taoism was all about one thing becoming another thing, this sort of constant sense of change. But whereas Taoism had this sense of boundless life and boundless sense of energy and was really disconnected from people, individuals, it was just this force that was flowing through the universe. Buddhism is really grounded in human experience and human suffering, and it deals with the ideas of death and mortality in a much more concrete way than Taoism. And it had, for several hundred years, developed a very rich traditions and rituals that sort of bolstered Taoist religious practices. Here we see in this depiction of Gautama Siddhartha, the Buddha, we see him meditating, his hands in his lap. The shape and form of hand gestures are called mudras. Buddha is in his legs crossed. He's wearing a monk's robe. He has a bun of hair on the top, and this is called the urna. Now, at the time of the earliest, this really was the way in which a prince might wrap their hair. Monks were traditionally bald. But as time goes on, this curly bundle of hair on his head actually becomes more and more stylized in China so that it becomes these very tight ringlets. Also want to point out, you notice he has very long earlobes. It was at the time that Buddha was a prince who renounced his kingdom, and so he had these heavy earrings that had stretched his ears. And as he had renounced his kingdom, he no longer wears the jewelry of a prince. Here is a remarkable limestone stele, which shows us both on one side the Lao Tzu deified, and on the other side Sakyamuni Buddhi. This is during the Northern Wei period when Buddhism and Taoism were sharing thoughts and ideas quite deeply. And we can see how the iconography of Taoism and the iconography of Buddhism are closely and tightly interlocked. Now, the figure on the left, that is the deified Lao Tzu, and you can tell he's wearing something more like a crown, and the one on the right is Sakyamuni Buddha, and you can see that urna on the top of his head. There came a number of different kinds of Taoist Immortals who, as they were originally depicted and as the religion began to expand and develop this idea of heavenly worthy Taoist Immortals, their iconography and their qualities are strikingly similar to the character and nature of Buddhist deities. And likewise, we also begin to see a kind of cross connection. Buddhist figures start to appropriate more indigenous ideas from Taoism. In the Gupta Empire, we start to see this kind of intense interest in Buddhism, and a number of people made the journey to India to understand what this was all about. Most famously, a scholar by the name of Xuanzang, who left an extremely detailed journey where he literally counted each step as he went from one place to another. So they have been able to calculate with incredible accuracy where he went and what he saw on his notes of these places. They've been able to rediscover some ancient archaeological sites based on the accuracy of his travels. Xuanzang, you see here, traveled from the north along the Silk Road into India, traversed all throughout the continent, and collected thousands and thousands of documents, artifacts, and images and brought them back to China, where he was hailed as a hero. His legendary exploits became so famous that they were spun out into all kinds of fantastical stories and eventually coalesced into a book by the name Journey to the West. And Xuanzang becomes the spiritual monk Tripataka, which means 3 baskets, which means he is the 3 baskets of all Buddhist teachings. And so this legendary story, Journey to the West, becomes a very important touchstone about the arrival of Buddhism in China. Now, a very important change had happened in Buddhism long before it had arrived in China. Within the first few hundred years, Buddhism had kind of split into 2 traditions, a Theravada Buddhism, which maintained a rather strict monasticism, where someone who wanted to be a Buddhist monk would really have to renounce everything, marriage, possessions, and would go into a monastery and meditate on the teachings of Buddha and hope to find enlightenment through that process. Another tradition, several hundred years later after the death of Buddha, was called Mahayana Buddhism, which boasted of being the greater vehicle. Maha means greater, yana, pathway. And so the Mahayana Buddhism saw that Buddha himself did not just focus on meditation. He was a great teacher. He sought to help others on their path to enlightenment, and that this is a very important part of the Buddhist teachings, is not just to find our own salvation and through meditation, but also to help others along their way through supporting monasteries, through helping others, donating food, building hospitals. All these sort of good works will help you find your own spiritual path. So in a sense, being engaged in the world in this important way is by making it easier for others to find enlightenment. And so Mahayana Buddhism creates this idea of the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva is a being who is restrained and held back from their enlightenment in order to help others along their way. The Gautama Buddha, Sakyamuni, he was a bodhisattva himself. He had enlightenment, and then he decides to stay on this earth and help others. So Mahayana Buddhism is trying to maintain that tradition of helping others like the Buddha himself. One of these deities then that become or not really deities, some of these figures, these bodhisattvas, these sort of spiritual beings that are helpers and guardians of Buddhism, they come into India now, and they are the vehicles that are there to help. Now, the Bodhisattva Guanyin is the Bodhisattva of mercy and compassion. And this is a figure that it begins in India. In this particular wood statue here, you see this exemplary form of the Guanyin, of the southern grotto. It's made of a very durable cypress wood, and it has this extraordinary sense of power and restraint, a kind of casualness and firmness. This statue is seen in the Kansas City Art Museum, the Nelson Atkins Museum. It is absolutely stunning. I highly recommend, if you are ever in Kansas City, to go and make a special trip to see this beautiful and incredible statue. It commands your presence. It has this kind of physical and very powerfully spiritual presence. And you can see how it calmly looks out with a kind of clarity and delicacy. So the adornments here, unlike the Buddha, who did not have any jewelry, the Bodhisattva has got jewels and a crown. Sort of indicates that there is a role to be played for someone in the material world, someone who still has possessions, is still grounded in the material world, and is willing to help others. Here we can see a statue of the Avalokitesvara from the Pala dynasty. This is the figure that would evolve into the Bodhisattva Guanyin that we see from China. Interestingly enough, the initial Indian statue is clearly masculine, and yet over the centuries, as we see the Bodhisattva Guanyin, this particular example is still masculine, but centuries later, the Bodhisattva Guanyin is more clearly depicted as a woman. Let's have our review quiz. Question 1. How is Taoism different from Confucianism? How has Taoism influenced Chinese culture? Question 3. How did Buddhism arrive in China? Question 4. In what ways did Buddhism influence Taoism? Question 5. What common ideas did Taoism and Buddhism share?